Hello YouTube, welcome back. Chris here. Today I'm going to do a video. This might be a little long-winded, but I'm going to answer a question I get probably more often than any other question in the bike shop. How do I pick out a replacement wheel that will fit my bike? Constantly getting people who have a wheel stolen, or they break a wheel beyond repair, or they just need a replacement for whatever reason. And it's a lot more complicated than you may think. There's a lot that goes into a replacement wheel. So I'm going to do a video breakdown here with a hopefully not boring slideshow presentation, going through pretty much every darn thing that you could need to know for replacing a wheel properly. And at the end I will do an abbreviated version too for more recreational people who just need to pick out a wheel to get their bike going. So here we go. This is how to buy the correct replacement wheel for your bicycle, everything you need to know. I am going to break this down into three categories. These categories go from most important to least important. The first one being specifications. Everything you need to know to make sure a wheel will actually fit in your bicycle. So if I buy this wheel, will it work? Yes or no? Number two is going to be more performance things. Okay, so I buy a wheel that fits, but will I be happy with it? Is it going to have the specs that will make it work well for what I'm using the wheel for? And will it kind of match what the bike is intended to have? And number three, still important, look. Will it look like one of my wheels was stolen and I took one from my kid's bike in the garage hoping no one would notice, or will it look like it belongs on my bike? First and foremost, easiest part of this, if you can't get this part right, you probably should just abandon this video, go to a professional and ask them. But number one, is it a front or a rear wheel? Obviously there's a difference between the front wheel of a bike and the rear wheel of a bike, so you need to know which one you're replacing. Specification number two, diameter of the rim or the wheel size. The wheel size is typically more commonly referred to as the tire size because it's going to determine what kind of tire will fit on the wheel. It's actually the rim size, the rim diameter. There's lots of different common sizes of wheels. Here I listed the most common. We got a 12-inch, 14-inch, 16-inch, 18, 20, 24, 26, 27.5, or used to be known more as 650B, 29-inch, or more commonly known as 700C, and old school 27-inch. This is by no means all the sizes of wheels out there, but these are the most common sizes you will see on bicycles. Some rims will be labeled with the size of the rim. A lot of times you will have to refer to the size of the tire on the rim, and at the bottom here I have kind of a little diagram of where you would find a wheel size on a tire. My arrow here pointing to this is a 700 by 35. There's a whole lot of numbers on here. They have an ISO bead seat diameter here of 622, and 37 is the width that goes with that. 28, more of a Canadian size. But again, what's really important is the 700 by 35. This goes to say 26, 18, 12, 24, lots of different things here, but this is an example of a 700. So you're looking for that first number, an X, and a second number. How does your wheel attach to your bicycle? Actually pretty important. So probably the most common you're going to see is going to be quick release skewer. So you have quick releases. These are levers that come out of your hub that make it easier to take the wheel on and off. A couple examples here. In this middle pictures we have through axles. Through axles are kind of like long bolts that actually act as the axle of the wheel. You can see this bottom picture here is a axle or a through axle with no wheel on it, and up here, they're pretty discreet. It's basically a big bolt with a hex head in it. Some of them do have kind of a quick release lever, but most of them look like this. Bolt-on. Bolt-on is literally what it sounds like. It is a nut, and it threads on the axle and holds the axle in place. Typically a 15 millimeter, but in some circumstances you have bigger nuts on there. In some circumstances you have smaller ones. So as you can see in this bottom right picture here, you have a threaded axle and a bolt that holds the wheel in place. So important to know when replacing a wheel. Typically bolt-on and quick release are interchangeable. So you can put a bolt-on wheel on a quick release as long as the rest of the specs match. Through axles kind of stand on their own, and there are several sizes of through axle. I'm not going to go too in depth with that in this video because it's just kind of getting way off track. Number 4, what kind of brakes does the bike have? So you have several different kinds of brakes the bike can use, and the wheel is very important for that because the wheel usually houses the braking surface in some form to determine how the bike will stop. So the first one and the most common one is rim brakes. Anything that requires a braking surface on the side of the rim, these are going to be like V-brakes, U-brakes, and cantilevers. And don't worry, my next slide will have examples of these. It was a lot to fit on one, so I put on the next one. Number 2, disc brakes. Disc brakes are a brake that attaches down by the hub of the bike, and it requires a rotor, which acts as a braking surface for this type of brake. If you do have a disc brake, it's important to know if it's either a 6-bolt or center lock rotor if you plan on using your pre-existing rotor from your old wheel on your replacement wheel. Drum brakes. Drum brake is a type of brake more commonly seen on oddball bikes, usually internally geared bikes. Kind of weird stuff, not super common. Most of the time you're not going to have to worry about drum brakes, but it's a brake that attaches to the side of the hub and has a system of braking where it kind of expands inside of itself to stop. Coaster brake, a lot of people refer to in layman's terms as a back pedal brake, is a brake that attaches, it's actually inside the hub. I will show you pictures of all these in the next slide here in specifications for examples. So here we have on the top left a V-brake. This is a rim brake, and important to note that all rim brakes will use, as far as picking out a wheel, all you need to know is a rim, drum, coaster, or disc. All rim brakes are the same as far as braking surface on the rim. So you don't need to know if it's a V-brake or a U-brake or a cantilever, you just need to know it's a rim brake. But here are examples of a V-brake, a cantilever, and a U-brake. Again, all these wheels are interchangeable. It's just a matter of the rim has to have a braking surface on it. Drum brake, as you can see, attaches to the outside of the hub. Again, not very common. Most of the time you won't have to worry about this. It's not something you're going to see very often. Coaster brake is internal in the hub, but has this steel bar that sticks out and attaches to the frame. And again, that's your back pedal brake. So if you really want to know if you have a coaster brake, this is going to be on kids' bikes and like beach cruiser single speed type bikes. The easiest way to tell, pedal the bike. If it freewheels when you pedal backwards, then it doesn't have a coaster brake. If it hits the brakes when you pedal backwards, it's got a coaster brake. Disc brakes, you have a brake located down by the hub and a rotor. And that's what this metal disc is that wraps around on the outside of the hub. That's your braking surface. So this acts as a braking surface instead of your rim. There are 2 different types of disc brakes, 6-bolt and center lock. In our next slide here, I'll show you the difference. So on your 6-bolt, which you see on the left here, you literally have 6 bolts. Typically they're T25 Torx head bolts. They go through the rotor and attach it to the hub. On the right side here, we can see a center lock hub. Center lock is a Shimano standard. They created this, and they are currently the ones who push it the most. And it attaches more like a cassette tool or a freewheel tool. It actually uses, if you're talking park tool, it's a FR5, just like you would use on a Shimano or SRAM cassette. And it's basically one simple tool to put this rotor on, as opposed to tightening up 6 individual bolts. If you do happen to get the wrong hub, there are adapters for these. You can get adapters to make a center lock into a 6-bolt. But anyway, if you're picking out the right wheel, you don't have to worry about adapters. And that's how I recommend doing it. Number 5, as far as specifications, how wide is the hub? Now this is not going to be super important for everybody, but in a lot of cases it will be. Most basic recreational road, mountain, and hybrid bikes will have standard widths of hubs, but there are hubs that will not, will be wider or narrower. For the most part, front hubs are typically 100 millimeters wide. There are some exceptions, but for the most part they're 100 millimeters wide. For rear hubs, they're often many different sizes. 130 millimeter, 135 millimeter, 142 for through axle is very common. 148 through axle is also very common. So There are a lot of different sizes. The way you will tell the width of your hub, you can take two different measurements. You can take a caliper or a tape measure with metric on it. You can, like you see on the left here, measuring the inside of the frame or fork from where the hub will contact the frame. Or you can take your existing wheel and measure the outside to outside of the hub from where the hub would contact the frame, and that will tell you the width. In both of these cases of these pictures, it's a 135mm width, which is probably the most common for a rear wheel. Is actually definitely the most common for a rear wheel, but not in every case is that going to work. So that's the easy way to tell. Most recreational bikes will have a 135 rear and a 100 front, but there's a lot of different standards out there now, so you do have to be careful in what you're selecting. Number 6, internal or external gearing. I'm going to talk more about external gearing because it's a lot more common, but it is worth noting you may have a bike with an internal gearing. What you see on the left here, a gear cluster, most bikes you see are going to have this. They will have a rear derailleur, which is what this first arrow is here, and then they will have a cassette or a freewheel, which is a whole bunch of different gears in the back, which is what this second arrow is pointing to. If you see any of that, if you see multiple speeds in the back, boom, external geared bike, which is going to be 99+ % of bikes will be external geared. On the right side here, internal gearing. The way you can tell is it has a single cog, you can see this top arrow, and it has a wider hub. But more importantly, it has a single cog. You would think it's a single speed, but if the bike has the ability to shift, you can tell it's internal gearing, so the shifting mechanism is actually inside this hub. You can also see in this picture, it's a good example of a drum brake. Drum brakes are very common with internally geared hubs because they just work well with that system. But we're mostly going to focus here on external gearing because it's so much more common. So specification number 7, this is for rear wheels only. It's important to know how many speeds are on the rear wheel. You have a single speed, which is one cog in the rear, internal gearing, one cog on the outside, but also has the ability to shift. These are typically 3, 5, 8, and I think 12 speeds. I don't do a ton of internal gearing, but I believe they have a 12-speed setup out there, maybe 11 from Shimano. I'm not 100% sure which one, but they do have different gearing options for internal gearing. Multi-speed, there's a lot of different options you can have. In the rear, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, or even 12 speed now. So this is important. In the next few slides, we'll cover why this is important. So the easiest way to find this out, look at your rear wheel. If it is an external geared bike, which most of them are, just count the number of rings back there. If it's an internal geared bike, look at the shifter. Does the shifter have 3 clicks, 5 clicks, 8 clicks, whatever it is? That's how many speeds it is. Okay, so this is for externally geared rear wheels. Very important. Cannot stress this enough. Is it a cassette or a freewheel? I often see people buy the wrong wheels because they don't understand the difference between these two. And it is hard to tell because they look very similar, but they are very different. This is kind of like a crocodile versus an alligator here. To the average person, they would never know the difference, but you need to because it's so important. On the left here is a cassette. On the right, a freewheel. So what's the difference? If you look at the lower picture on the left, you can see just a cassette in my hand. You can see it's a bunch of little metal rings, no bearings, no moving mechanism. It's just a whole bunch of metal rings that fit onto a mechanism on the hub that has bearings and pawls and moving parts. The freewheel is a contained system, so everything you need to operate this, all the moving parts are in this little cluster that you're seeing in my hand on the right. So the easiest way to tell if you don't take the device off the bike is from the outer lock ring. So if you look at the one on the left, the cassette on the left, at the top you'll see kind of a raised lock ring that locks down all these little metal rings. If you look at the freewheel, it's all one piece. So this comes off in one piece and the cassette comes off in multiple pieces. Okay, so if you have a cassette rear wheel, it is incredibly important to know the speeds and the type of cassette. Majority, probably 99+% are going to be Shimano standard, but you do need to know if it's an 8 to 10 speed Shimano or an 11 speed Shimano. Now also when I say Shimano, It's important to know that this standard applies to many brands. A Shimano cassette, SRAM cassette, Sunrace, Microshift, Miche, these all use the same splines. So pretty much anything except for Campagnolo, as far as a cassette, uses the same setup. So you don't have to worry about that. The reason there's 8 to 10 and 11 speed, as we grew more and more speeds in the cassette range, we added a wider cassette body. You'll see this in the next slide, so I'll discuss it more there. But it is important to know an 8 to 10 speed will fit in an 11 with a spacer, but an 11 speed cassette will not fit on a 10. But again, I'll show you this more in the next slide. If you have a Campagnolo cassette, that's worth noting. You will need to know that in purchasing a wheel because it is a different free hub body. I'll show that in the next slide. XD body driver from SRAM, or a Shimano Uniglide, which is super uncommon. I did a whole video on it, but we'll talk about those here in the next slide with the examples. So a Shimano and SRAM cassette standard, top left here. This is going to be majority of wheels, and anything that is 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 speed will fit this, but there are two different body hubs, and we'll talk about that here shortly. The next one, middle top, is XD body driver. This is a newer standard from SRAM. It actually kind of fits on a little bit more like a Freewheel, but it is a cassette. The whole cassette turns as you take it off. There is no lock ring. The tool fits right down in the outside ring. This cassette was designed so they could go to a smaller tooth count. So a typical cassette will go as small as an 11 tooth before they run out of space to make it smaller. The XD body driver was designed to make it smaller, so you can now run a 10 tooth in the rear. The next one, super uncommon, Shimano Uniglide. Uniglide looks like a cassette. It is a cassette, but the outer ring does not have a lock ring. It actually works more like a track cog, where the last ring actually threads on to tighten the whole thing down. Let's go to the bottom photos here. Bottom left will show you the difference between a 7 to 10 speed body hub and an 11 speed body hub. Like I said before, a 7 to 10 speed cassette will fit an 11 speed body hub as long as you have a spacer, and you can see the spacer down here in the picture on this 11 speed body hub, but an 11 speed cassette will not fit a 7 to 10. Not a huge concern because most wheels you buy nowadays are 11 speed compatible, but worth noting if you're buying a used wheel or an older wheel, if it's a 10 speed wheel, it's not going to work with your 11 speed cassette from your more modern bike. So something to keep in mind. On the bottom right here, we have a Campagnolo cassette. The cassette looks pretty much identical to a Shimano cassette. One big important difference is the splines. So on the way bottom right, you will see a Campagnolo free hub body, and it has a different spline pattern than a Shimano, SRAM, or everybody else pattern. The Italian standard, they like to make things difficult and like to make it so they don't conform with the rest of the world. The easiest way to tell if you have a Campagnolo free hub body is, as the arrow points out here, this little step tooth cog or a step tooth spline is going to indicate that it's Campagnolo, and it will only fit a Campagnolo cassette. With Campagnolo, it's the kind of thing you don't have to worry too much about. If you have it, you probably already know you have it. It's not something you have to seek out, oh, is it Shimano or Campagnolo? Most people that own this already know they own this. So most people, like I said before, are dealing with the Shimano SRAM standard, which is going to be your top left. And that's what vast majority of bikes are going to have to worry about. All right, this is another one that if you have it, you probably already know you have it, but not very common, but you may need to know. So this is symmetric versus asymmetric rear dishing. Some bikes nowadays are coming with an asymmetric rear end, meaning the bike is actually off center. And the reason they do this is a traditional wheel, like you're going to see on the left side of this diagram, actually is dished off center because the cassette on the right side of the bike is bigger than the disc brake or no brake on the left side of the bike. They have shorter spokes on the right and longer spokes on the left. A zero dish wheel makes a perfect triangle like you see on the right diagram there. The reason they do that is it's technically stronger. Now to counteract that, because the cassette is still bigger and protrudes on one side, they make an asymmetric rear end. So a zero dish rear wheel is going to fit in a bike that has one side of the bike stick out further than the other. Not super important for most people. If you own this bike with this offset, you probably already know it, but worth noting because that is important for selecting the right wheel. Okay, now we have gotten out of specifications and into performance. Now you could consider this a specification, but for the most part, you can change tubes. You can, on some wheels, you can even drill out the hubs to fit a Schrader valve if it's Presta, or if it's a Schrader hole and you want to put a Presta in it, you can put a shim in it. But it is important to know the valve type. So you have a Presta valve and a Schrader valve. On the left, you see a Schrader valve, much more commonly used in the US. This is the same thing as you're going to see on a car tire or really any recreational bike. On the right side is your Presta valve. This is a higher end valve. You can see on higher end bikes. Higher pressure. It's got a valve you can open and close on by yourself to let air in or out. And again, not super important, but it may be worth looking at when you select your new wheel, especially if you have a Presta in the front and you're buying a rear wheel and you don't want to have two different valves. It is kind of important to have the same thing. So Presta valve or Schrader valve. The next thing to consider in the performance category is the rim material. For recreational bikes, you can buy steel rims. These are usually super basic and super on the budget side. They're typically single wall rims, which we'll cover here in a slide or two. But steel rim, steel spokes, steel hub, heavy, fairly durable, inexpensive. Your next step up, you have aluminum rims. The majority of wheels you're going to purchase are going to be aluminum wheels, where you have an aluminum rim and they're a little bit lighter weight and a little more expensive. And you have your top of the line, your carbon rim. Now, if you're purchasing a wheel for a recreational bike, the carbon rim is probably not too important to you because this is, again, one of those things, if you have it, you're already going to know you have it and you're going to replace accordingly. Next in the performance category, we talk about rim quality and durability. On the left side, we see an example of a single wall rim. A single wall rim basically has one layer of material. The spoke nipples come through and kind of protrude on the inside of the rim and have to have a nice thick rim strip to cover them so they don't puncture the tube. A double wall rim actually has two layers of material. It's basically got a single wall rim on top and an extra loop material on the bottom where the spokes attach and the spoke nipples poke through. This double wall rim will have holes that the nipples will drop down into, so your rim strip will just have to cover the holes and not so much the top of the spoke nipples. The reason for these two different types of rims, double wall rim is a lot tougher, stronger, more durable, less prone to bending, breaking, cracking, denting, etc. Your single wall rim is a lot more budget friendly. So if you are purchasing a wheel, consider the rider weight, the function of the wheel, the use of the wheel, and what kind of performance you need out of that rim before you purchase one or the other. The rim width. Not super important if you kind of know you're getting the right kind of wheel as far as like a mountain bike, road bike, BMX wheel. It will have a decent, at least in the ballpark of the rim width that you're looking for. But it is important to note that they do make rims in different widths. They're not usually very well labeled, but you can easily measure them with a tape measure or a caliper. But worth noting that there are different width rims for different purposes. The one on the left here is more of a road bike rim. The middle one is more of a hybrid to entry-level mountain bike rim. And the one on the right is a BMX rim that's super wide. Worth noting that there are different width rims and you need to select according to what you plan to do with the wheel. Number 5, spoke count. How many spokes are on the wheel? So they do make different variations of spokes based on durability and what the bike is used for. A couple examples here on the left. This is actually a tandem wheel, and I counted these out. There's actually 40 spokes on that wheel. Not very common, but in a tandem, you got to think you have the rider weight of 2 adults. You need a pretty durable wheel on that bike, especially if it's a mountain bike like the one I pulled this wheel off of is. On the right, we have a carbon road racing wheel. Very low spoke count. I think this is a 20 spoke wheel. So half the amount of spokes, but still very strong, but a lot lighter weight and much simpler. The most common spoke counts are going to be in multiples of 4 because they typically count spokes out in 4 as they cluster together that way with a crossing pattern. So typically 20, 24, 28, 32, or 36 hole are the most common patterns of spokes you're going to find, but there are lots of different ways you can build a wheel and a lot of different spoke counts. Important to note, if you're looking for durability, maybe you got a real heavy rider, or maybe you're a touring guy and you're going to carry 100 pounds of gear on your bike, you might want a super high spoke count wheel. Or if you're a road racer and you want a little lighter wheel, you want a lower spoke count wheel. Along with spoke count, we got to look at spoke pattern. Very important. The first picture here is what's called a radial laced wheel. That means there's no crossing of the spokes. Each spoke comes straight out of the hub and straight to the rim. They are just straight. It is the weakest form of spoke lacing, but it is also the lightest way to lace a wheel. You're going to see this more on performance bikes. It's not going to be much on recreational bikes. Again, you're trading off weight for durability. The second picture is a 2-cross. They do make single cross wheels, but they're not super common. I don't have a good picture of one. So you're going to see more 2-cross than 3-cross. So this is a 2-cross. 2-cross means that each spoke overlaps 2 other spokes. And you can see the arrows here showing where these overlap. This is going to be a little more durable wheel. And 2-cross is a very common pattern. The last one's 3-cross, which is probably the most common pattern when you're talking recreational wheels. Very durable. The more times a spoke crosses over other spokes, it has basically more sharing of load with other spokes and other parts of the rim, and it tends to be stronger. So 3-cross is a very strong pattern for spoke lacing. Spoke gauge. I won't talk too much about this because it's not going to be too super important, but it is worth noting there are different gauges of spokes. The spokes on the left are a 2 gauge, very thick, heavy duty, not going to bend or break easily. I believe that this one I took this picture of is that tandem wheel. The one on the right is a 1.6 gauge, so slightly narrower. This is off of more of a road racing bike. Different gauges to give you a different balance between strength and weight. Also different spoke types. We have round spokes like you see on the left here, and you also have bladed spokes like you see on the right. Bladed spokes are a little more aerodynamic, a lot more difficult to replace and source, but it is something you see on a lot of wheels. You also have something called a straight pull versus a J-bend. Not too important, we won't talk too much about it, but a straight pull comes straight out of the hub and goes to the rim. A J-bend hooks through the hub flange and goes to the rim, but things to consider when picking out a new wheel. Number 9, nipple material. So the spoke nipple is what attaches the spoke to the rim. The 2 common materials are going to be brass and alloy. They both have their advantages. Brass are super strong, tough, rarely break, but they are heavy. Alloy is lighter weight, but they are more prone to breaking over time and wear. Again, these are not super important points to the wheel. These are more performance facts as opposed to specifications. But this could judge how happy you are with your purchase if you buy a wheel and it's not as durable as you thought it was, or it's too durable and not as light as you thought it would be. So things to consider when purchasing a wheel. Rim depth. So there's obviously shallow depth rims, they're a little bit lighter weight, and deep dish rims, which are a little bit more aerodynamic and more for racing. Again, not going to be a huge factor, and if you do have something like a really deep wheel you're trying to match, you probably already know that and would buy accordingly, but it is worth noting there is a difference there in rim depth. Hub flanges as well. There are super low profile hub flanges like you see on the zip hub on the bottom here, and there are high flange hubs like you see on these hubs up here on the top right. This is almost more of a look thing. Yes, there is some performance aspect to it, but if you're trying to match like a vintage bike with a high flange hub, you probably don't want to put a low flange wheel on it to make it look period correct and match maybe the other wheel on the bike. Tubeless compatibility. So worth noting, if you are currently running tubeless wheels and you're replacing one, is the new wheel going to be tubeless as well? There's different levels of tubeless. You've got tubeless ready where you just throw a tire on, some sealant, and it's ready to go. You've got tubeless compatible, where you can put a different rim strip in and it's, seals up easily, it's ready to go. And there's some wheels that are just impossible to convert. So worth noting what you're buying if you plan on going tubeless on your bike. Alright, and last here we have look. Now this, some people look over this, but it is important to a lot of people. If you have a bike and your front wheel is all black hub, black spokes, black nipples, black rim, and you go to buy a new rear wheel and it's all silver, it's going to look kind of goofy. So something to consider. What's the rim color, hub color, spoke color, nipple color, to try to make it match. And it doesn't really affect the performance of the bike, but for aesthetic, you may want to make it match. So this last slide here, we're going to wrap this up. I know I just threw a ton of information at you, and most of you probably won't digest most of it if you're trying to learn this, but I have also linked this in the description. This is an abbreviated version, more for recreational bikes. Now, if you've got some unique technology in like a road bike or a mountain bike that's new, cutting edge stuff, that does some goofy technology to achieve some gear range or some weird type of, I don't know, anything, this probably won't apply. If you are just a recreational rider and you need to replace a wheel on your bike and you don't know how to do it, these are the real basics. So you don't need all the other jazz. This will help you buy a wheel for 90+% of recreational bikes. Number 1, front or rear wheel. Number 2, the size of the wheel. Number 3, quick release through X or a bolt-on. Most of them would be quick release or bolt-on. Number 4, rim, disc, or coaster brake. If you do have disc, it is important to note 6-bolt or center lock. Number 5, freewheel or cassette. That's if you're doing a rear wheel, of course. Number 6, number of speeds on the rear wheel, also rear wheels only. And number 7, and this question will actually eliminate most of the things I talked about, is the type of bike that it is. If it's a road bike, mountain bike, hybrid bike, comfort bike, whatever it is, if you go to a shop or you search for a mountain bike wheel online, knowing the type of bike will eliminate the majority of the wheels out there and narrow your search quickly. So if you know the type of bike, that helps dramatically limit the amount of options of wheels. And number 8, I still think it's super important, the color of the rim, hub, and spokes. So like I said before, this list here can be found in the description for your use. I hope I didn't make this too complicated for you. I know it's pretty long-winded. Picking out a wheel, it's kind of like a game of guess who. You got to eliminate the blondes, the ones with glasses, who has a mustache, who has a beard, if they're wearing a hat, and eventually you can narrow it down to the right wheel. But it takes a lot of eliminating variables to get rid of a lot of wrong wheels first. So for most people, this is a very difficult process. If you have any questions, concerns, comments, please leave them below. If you like this video, if you found it helpful, please like, please subscribe. I'm going to make some more like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.